Welcome, folks. We are just letting people in out of the meeting room, the waiting room. So just bear with us a moment while we let people in and give folks a moment to arrive. If you want to rename yourself as you're coming in, feel free to right-click on your own square, and you can easily change your name, add your affiliation, pronouns, or anything else that you wish to add. And we'll get started in just a minute. Looks like we're going to have a good crowd today, so just give us a second and we will go ahead and let people in. And then we'll go ahead and get started in a moment. I think what we're going to do is I will get started with my announcements and introducing myself, which is the vastly less interesting part than hearing from our guests. So that will give us a minute to let more people in. Again, just a quick moment of logistics. If you're just joining us, please mute as you come in. You should already be muted. And feel free to rename yourself using the menu in the upper right of your own square or by right-clicking on your own square. I'm sure our speakers would love to know who is here, and so that you can participate actively in the question and answer we will be doing as part of this. My name is Beth Novak. I'm a professor at Northeastern University and director of the Burns Center for Social Change and host of this wonderful lecture series on AI and reimagining democracy, rebooting democracy, as we like to call it. This is an ongoing series that began a few years ago, and where we continue to explore the ways in which technology now, especially AI and generative AI, might help us to reinvigorate, reimagine, and strengthen participatory democracy. This is an intentionally hopeful series of conversations where our goal is to explore what's possible. We have two fantastic guests joining us here today. We have, and I'm very delighted to introduce Ariel Procaccia from Harvard University. Oh, I'm even pleased to repeat, we have three guests joining us here today. Let me reiterate. We have Ariel Procaccia, who is Gordon McKay Professor of Computer Science at Harvard University. I'm going to put bios in the chat so everybody can read more about our illustrious guests. Or Sam, if you would go ahead and do that, that would be wonderful, because we want to hear more from you rather than just about you. We also have Robert Bjarnason joining us from Iceland. Robert is the president, CEO, and founder of Citizens Foundation. And we also have Colin McGill, founder and CEO of Polis, who are joining us here today. So we're delighted to have this conversation with you, and we're going to get started by talking somewhat about sort of where we're coming from in terms of participatory democracy in the age of the web, and hopefully move us into really talking about what AI means and what generative AI mean for different forms of participatory democracy. We'll add those links in just a second in the chat, but let me get us started with our conversation. And just with a quick anecdote, which is we have a number of folks here from our team at the GovLab and the Burns Center who've done some work with various jurisdictions on participatory democracy over the years. We've done some great work on a platform that was created in Madrid, Decide Madrid, that some people here may be familiar with or associated with. 460,000 people have signed up for that platform since it was founded about 5 years ago. But in fact, that platform, while it's had many successes, it does quite a number of different things that have been extremely successful, including participatory budgeting and other features. The idea of having citizens propose policy has led in the end really to arguably only one policy actually being co-designed by citizens as a result of that. So I think there's a lot of reasons that we have not realized the hope that we had for e-democracy, as we used to call it when the web first started. We have not, if we look around us today, surely in the United States, and as well as elsewhere, the kind of vision that we had for a truly Periclean golden age of democracy has not come to fruition. So I want to sort of be mindful of that as we have this conversation and really talk about what it is that we think we've done wrong and what it is that we think that we could do right to maybe realize that hope that all of us have had and that get each of you out of bed every day. So let me go around and just ask each of our three guests to quickly introduce yourselves. We put bios in the chat and degrees and all of that stuff. What we want to know very quickly from you is about your work in participatory democracy in a minute or less. So Ariel, let me start with you and then go to Robert and over to Colin.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm really delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So I'm a professor of computer science at Harvard. I work on a bunch of different areas: theoretical computer science, AI, game theory, social choice. So I dabble in a lot of things, but one thing I've always been passionate about is this intersection of kind of computer science, math, and democracy. So thinking about how to use these technical tools from CS and math to support democratic innovation. I've worked on a bunch of different paradigms, including participatory budgeting that Beth just mentioned, liquid democracy, political redistricting, sortition that we may talk about later. So I've looked at many different aspects of this intersection. And in the applied work for my group, we've created a bunch of kind of nonprofit open source platforms for doing things like helping people fairly divide stuff or make smart collective decisions. So maybe we'll talk about some examples of those later as well.
Robert, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Beth, for inviting me. So yeah, my background, I'm an entrepreneur. I started the first internet companies in Iceland and Denmark in 93 and 95. I worked, quite a bit in video games, including creating the first mobile versions of the Sims game. But in 2008, I was in London working, and the financial crisis hit Iceland pretty badly. All our banks went bankrupt over a period of 10 days. And sort of trust in the parliament and the government plummeted over a period of a very short time. And Iceland has one of the oldest sort of still running parliaments, founded in the year 930. So over 1,000 years, we've had like pretty good trust in the parliament and government. But the financial crisis sort of just took that all away. It plummeted to 7%. So I, with some group of good people, we started to look into ways of using the internet to help governments make better decisions, because that was sort of what we identified as a part of the financial crisis, is sort of the mismatch of government capabilities to take decisions in the modern world. And citizen engagement was sort of the tool that we found to be sort of most promising in terms of bringing, both sort of tapping into the collective intelligence of people to make better decisions, but also increase transparency, for example. And we've been quite successful since 2008. Well, actually, it was our 15th birthday on the 19th of October. And we've been running thousands of engagement projects with our open source tools in 45 countries so far.
And Colin, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Colin McGill. I am president of the Computational Democracy Project, which is a US 501c3 nonprofit. That is the successor organization to a startup that got going in 2012. And so we're about 11 years into to building an open source platform, developing, maintaining, and advancing called Polis. Polis has been used in probably the example that's been written about the most is in Taiwan and the regulation of Uber, but it's also deployed as national infrastructure by the government of the United Kingdom and Finland. The purpose of Polis is specifically focused around scale, and some of the larger conversations have had tens of thousands of people and millions of votes in one exercise. Usually a conversation in Polis will take place over a couple of weeks, but the idea generally is mapping. Mapping opinions, mapping perspectives, and then reporting out into subsequent processes, something that can be used as a kind of map of the realm. Insofar as we're concerned about mapping, we want to know what's there, and so our methodological focus is really very much on emergent phenomenon and unsupervised learning. And so unsupervised machine learning in the sense that we're looking for patterns as they exist in a population, not necessarily as a survey researcher might go in with their own biases. We'd like, the survey researcher or the conversation facilitator, so to speak, to be able to kind of ring a bell, and then see what sounding comes back, so to speak. The idea there, in general, has been used in national scale regulation, but also then picked up and advanced in Twitter's platform Community Notes. We started working with them about a year before the acquisition, and happy to share plenty of links about from their paper and others. So if anybody's interested in Community Notes and the way in which concepts have advanced into the social media sphere, I'm happy to talk about that as well, though it might be slightly off our topic today. But it's been a very exciting collaboration.
Great. We'll look forward to, please also as we go along, feel free to share links in the chat. We've started to share some, but feel free to add other things. Colin has mentioned started to mention some specific examples. And Robert, let me pass it back to you to ask you, just by way of illustration, if you could give us an example, less about the platforms and more about the uses, sort of what from your perspective is the problem that has most successfully been solved with one of the platforms that you've developed. What does that look like? Who was using the tools and for what purpose? Yes,
absolutely. And you're right, Beth, it's not about the platforms. I mean, the platforms are just tools. The main challenge, is actually on the political side, on the government side. How do you integrate those sort of tools so they actually can offer meaningful input into decision making? And I think our best example is in Iceland, where we started with our Better Reykjavik platform in 2010, and has now grown into, while we're working with 20 municipalities in Iceland, so covering most of the country, and also with the national government on projects. And it's all about the culture. It's about the culture of recognizing that engaging the citizens can actually help. It can help, improve decision making on many levels. For example, many municipalities put most of their new policies into consultation, and there's no PDFs involved. They put them into consultation where people are engaged on the subject matters in the policy proposals that matter to them. And planning, for example, also so planning work. One example from only a couple of months ago, in the third largest municipality in Iceland, they're making a new center of the town, and there are plans for that. And suddenly on social media, there was an eruption of negativity. There was people saying that it's no good, and it was looking like it was a lot of controversy about it. So they used the opportunity of the platforms just to put it into a referendum, like a mini referendum. And in Iceland, we have electronic IDs. People have that so they can vote securely online. And there was a mini referendum about this, center of town with a lot of people participating. 89% approved of it. 11% didn't approve of it. While over on Facebook, on Twitter, it was all arguments, So, I think that's one of the things. And then finally, I think sort of what we call sort of mass engagement, participatory budgeting, where we have double-digit participation rates, 20% plus, where governments recognize, if they are having such a wide and popular project that they need to work with advertisement agencies to promote it so everybody knows about it. And so I think that's sort of our most sort of successful, and what we're most proud of is that how we've helped sort of across the political spectrum governments to sort of recognize that it's a valuable tool, to make decisions. And that's sort of what we set out for.
So let me go back to you, Colin, first, and then to Ariel. You mentioned a number of examples just sort of in passing, but I'm wondering if you could go a little deeper on just one of them to really help to illustrate this question of where has there been an institution you've worked with, whether in the UK or Taiwan or elsewhere, that's really been able, from your perspective, to solve a problem with tech-enabled participation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll briefly say, Robert, that I got a chance to go to Iceland and stand in Thingvellir. Hopefully I'm pronouncing it right, at the Rift and at the Hill. So that was very, very meaningful. Yeah, okay, great. Hopefully I got that right. It was very meaningful. So I'll say that I'll say that I would really love to point towards some of the partners that we've worked with, including Policy Lab in the UK. I think that one of our experiences is that policy innovation units, whether that's PDIS in Taiwan, Citra in Finland, or the one that I'll talk about today, Policy Lab in the UK. Now, policy innovation units, if people are unfamiliar, have a really interesting mandate and power in these three cases. PDIS and Citra and Policy Lab are they're endowed with a mission to go do experimental policy at national scale in governments. They're pretty rare, and I'm not sure exactly if we have a really great example in the US, except maybe xd.gov, which not a lot of people have heard about, but it does exist in census. xd.gov is intended to be in the same spirit. And that's from Kate McCall from MIT. She's been running that. Now, I think the thing in Policy Lab that really stands out, and I'll just share this link here. Is it useful to share a screen, or just I'll share a link so everybody can get to it at least. Here we go. Is that they've got a regulation on fisheries. Fisheries environmental management is, I think, a particularly well adapted case study we've seen come up in New Zealand as well. That is biodiversity. Because it cross-cuts so many different stakeholders within society. Fisheries management not only implicates fishermen, but also those who live in towns with ports. Of course, those in environmental management and those those who live there, those who travel, those in tourism. And so, in this case, there's a mandate, to do policy innovation unit that involves ethnography. And they're going out and doing that. And so they're doing in-person interviews with some dozens of people. The tech-enabled bit of that is, can we go from what we can do in person with dozens to then scaling up to thousands of people, going back to thousands multiple times throughout the engagement, and then bringing that in one coherent report and consultation that's been written. Also, not something that we've seen a lot of in the US, but we work mostly not in the United States. So the Computational Democracy Project does work on bids where, from the business perspective, you've got a government which is calling for a consultation, and then a consultation provider which is getting paid to do this professionally and deliver it, and then a report which is being delivered back to the government as a result and as a deliverable, which is a really nice pattern for getting the routinization of citizen engagement in place. And so this is an example of that exists inside the government, but of course consultations also are bid on by companies and organizations outside as well. The fisheries management case study is really nice. I've got a little video on this as well if you've ever clicks the link and goes through. But in general, the engagement is intended to be cross-stakeholder and cross geographies, where showing up in person might not be feasible as well across all of the areas that are affected by a large fishery in this example.
So Ariel, let me bring it over to you. We've heard discussion now of two different, very diverse examples. And so I'm curious, sort of these have the kind of work that Colin do and that Robert do, both focused on defining problems with residents, co-creating and designing solutions with residents. If I understand correctly, tend to be work that is much more oriented towards non-representative forms of engagement. And I think there's lots of advantages. Colin, I think you do work in both spaces, and Robert, a lot of it is self-selected participation, if you will, which really gets at people's passions. A lot of the work that you are working on, Ariel, tends to focus on representative forms of engagements and the role that technology plays there. I'm wondering if you could shed a little more light on some of the experiments that you've been doing and how they tend to differ and why that space, and we'll tease that apart a little more as we go forward.
Yeah, definitely. So on high level, a paradigm that I've been really excited about is this idea of sortition. which is a paradigm of democracy built on the idea of choosing representatives at random instead of through an election. So this has a lot of historical precedent, but one place where we've seen this a lot in recent years is in the form of citizens' assemblies, which are randomly selected groups of people from all walks of life that are usually convened by local or national governments. And they typically meet for a period of weeks or months to deliberate, and they reach a decision that typically the idea is to inform policymakers through the decision. One crucial point about the citizen assemblies, as Beth said, is that they are selected to be representative of the population. This is a property called descriptive representation. So the idea is that you want to be representative across different dimensions like gender, age, ethnicity, level of education, geographical area, if it's at the national level, and sometimes even position on the issue at hand. If it's climate change, it could be something like how concerned you are about climate change and stratifying over that. So that's the high level idea. This has been happening on a wide scale around the world, not so much in the US, but I would say especially in Europe at the national level as well. There are many success stories in assemblies that have led to legislation at the national level. Now, the challenge is that these assemblies are selected from a pool of volunteers. So there is this participatory aspect, the self-selection aspect, in that people opt in and volunteer to participate, but you still want the assembly to be representative of the population, even though the pool of volunteers is highly unrepresentative of the population typically. So for example, people with a high level of education are much more likely to opt in, in most cases. To give you another example, if it's an assembly about climate change, somebody who's skeptical about climate change is unlikely to opt in. So these are things that we see in practice all the time. So the challenge from an algorithmic perspective, it turns out this is quite difficult, is that we want to select a representative assembly from this biased pool of volunteers. And at the same time, we want to be fair to everybody, to give everybody a fair chance of participating. So these two requirements of fairness and descriptive representation are both crucial to the legitimacy of citizens' assemblies, but it turns out it's pretty difficult to satisfy both of these things together. And what we've worked on is we've worked on algorithms for doing the random selection that are able to get these two things simultaneously to the degree possible. And these algorithms have been implemented through a nonprofit open source free platform called Panelot, which stands for Panel Selection by Lot. And that's been used by now for a couple of years around the world, including for some of these national assemblies in Europe. Maybe I'll mention one other thing. Robert kind of said that a big part of the challenge is kind of not designing the platform, but getting policymakers to actually adopt the solutions. I think we've had it easy because we've collaborated with nonprofits like the ones run by Robert and Colin. So that allowed us to focus on the technical part of how we solve this technical problem, and we let them worry about how to get policymakers to actually adopt the solutions.
I want to get more into this question of representative versus non-representative forms of engagement as we move forward. Let me just make a quick process note here, which is if you have questions for our speakers, we will be moving into Q&A hopefully in soonish. And so please use the chat in this case to post your questions so that we can call on you. Let me though move back to kind of the point that I opened with, which was this point about, or this argument that the World Wide Web has in many ways, of course, helped us to, I think, enable the kinds of participatory democracy that you have been working on over the face-to-face world that preceded the web. But I would argue that, again, we have fallen short. So I think for us to get into a conversation about where AI helps us, it's important to identify what have been the challenges and limitations to date. So Robert, maybe let me go back to you first and just sort of briefly, because we want to talk about the solutions and the AI. What have been the disappointments to date, would you say, or what are the problems to which AI could hopefully be the solution?
Yeah, I think that, having, been around the internet, very early, like in 93, starting this, internet service, provider in Iceland, there was a lot of sort of utopic ideas about what the internet would be, and what it would do, how it would make us all free and democratic, and like everybody would have a voice and so on, which is quite beautiful, in a way. And but when we started in 2008, I mean, that was sort of, social media was just starting then, and I think that, in a way, the information space was a lot more sort of decentralized in 2008 than it is today. And I think that's been a real shame. I think that's one of the big challenges in terms of, having platforms that have incentives, for example, to surface arguments, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of, actually creating real problems in real cities, or municipalities around the world. And, I think that the potential, just the potential is so much. I mean, we've already seen with tools, with social media being, defective as it is, there's so much potential there. And for example, we learned really early on that, we had to make peace with social media. We had to make our tools and solutions like an extension of social media. So for example, in the successful sort of mass citizen engagement projects we run, social media and sort of this badly, defective, information ecosystem with monopolies and like a few handful of rich guys and the Chinese government, like, in charge, and I think that's sort of, big challenges. But even like, TikTok, I mean, we, like the city of Reykjavik and the municipalities, I mean, they've used TikTok to promote to young people for like, a few years now. So I'd say, yes, there's been a lot of disappointment in terms of how those platforms have been enabled to be gatekeepers. But now we're having a new transformation. We're having an AI transformation. So I think that there's a new opportunity to rethink how our information system works. But the biggest challenge is like, is governments and civil society going to be strong enough to actually mold it in a better shape than we have seen, recent years with, the social media ecosystem?
Colin, anything you want to add here, or Ariel, either of you?
I'll use my, since this is a hopeful space, I'll use my time just briefly to point ahead. I think that what the previous administration in Twitter, Parag's administration, was able to accomplish with community notes is the most profound, large-scale social media experiment of collective intelligence in human history. So I'll share a number of links into the chat. I don't think it's gotten nearly enough airtime, and so I'll share the links that I have. And I'll briefly just try to say a few words about them. Ann Applebaum had written in The Atlantic in, I think, 2019, calling for Twitter to build a misinformation system built on Polis. They did, in fact, and we worked with them. And the outcome of that has been, it doesn't solve the entire misinformation problem by far, but it solves it does solve a part of it and a meaningful component of it in a way that can be advanced. And many of the criticisms that are valid criticisms are actually attainable. One of the important things with engineering when a system is in development and in production is, are these criticisms something that the team is aware of, and are they going to actually attack these problems or not? And so early on in its development, there are specific kind of critiques like, well, it won't scale because if you community note one thing, lots of other people shared the same article. And well, if there's a community note on one link now, some months later, it shows on every other link. And so it also goes backwards to anybody who retweeted any of those links. So it goes, if it's a successful note, it goes horizontally across and then backwards back up to anybody who retweeted so that it can propagate that context from the system. And so I'll say that, there has been no shortage of discussion about the disappointments, but I'll use my time that way and say that I think that the experiment is successful and profound, and can be advanced and probably generalized as well.
So let's, we do want to, there's so much doomsaying and naysaying, so we are intentionally very hopeful here. But I think it is so. So let me move us in that direction even more to really ask then what AI does for us in this conversation. So what is, whether it's directly responsive to a problem or creating a new opportunity. Ariel, let me go back to you and sort of ask whether it's something that's already happening or something you'd like to see happen. Where do you see the greatest potential now from AI in deepening participatory democracy?
Yeah, so let me give maybe one kind of a narrow answer to this, kind of thinking about one project, one direction we've been thinking about. So I think Colin's wonderful work on Polis is just a good starting point. Think about this kind of system that gets as input people's opinions and votes on opinions and outputs essentially a slate of comments that's representative of the discussion. Mm-hmm. So one thing that's interesting, like from my viewpoint, is that there are formal ways to think about what representation means coming from social choice and computational social choice. And like at a very high level, the intuition is that if you have n participants and you have a slate of size k, then a group of size n over k of participants, any such group deserves, a say in the slate, right? Deserves some representation on the slate by virtue of its size. So that's kind of the high-level intuition that you can capture mathematically. And social choice theory gives us ways of capturing that. So thinking about what would be a formally representative output for a discussion like that. The shortcoming of social choice is that it's limited to predefined alternatives. So essentially, you have a set of candidates in a political election, like that's one example to keep in mind. And a lot of the, you can think about electing a committee in this context. A lot of the techniques are designed for this kind of scenario with predefined alternatives. And what's exciting about this case is that the candidates here are actually statements, right? So you want to select a committee of K statements. So your set of alternatives is all possible statements in the world. Like that's something that's very difficult to reason about. It's not kind of a nice, small, predefined set. And that's where I think LLMs can come in and can do something very exciting, which is that they allow us to generate new alternatives. So even if you want to think about statements that were not explicitly proposed by people, that's something that an LLM can do, can generate new statements that can generate more consensus. You can do things like predict people's opinions over unseen statements. And more generally, I think you can, thinking about this shortcoming of social choice, you can generate alternatives. So if you think about something like Brexit, where the alternatives were either stay in the European Union and everything would be the same, or leave completely, you can think about many intermediate alternatives that were not even on the ballot, but in a world like this, where we generate alternatives, could have been on the ballot as well. So that's kind of where I think the potential of LLMs can be in transforming social choice. Now, specifically, what we've been working on is thinking about a Polis-inspired system, but where we use LLMs in order to generate a formally representative set of statements that's formally representative with respect to the set of all possible statements. So that's kind of the high-level project. I know that Colin has been working in a similar direction as well. He might mention that. One thing worth mentioning is that we have also worked on this with OpenAI in the last couple of months. They've been very interested in using, kind of designing novel democratic processes for AI governance. So thinking about ethical questions in the design of LLMs. And we've been working with them to answer some of these questions. So for example, to what degree should LLMs be personalized? And deploying this kind of process, getting public input and aggregating it in this way with LLMs in order to get answers about LLM governance. So this is something that we're kind of wrapping up now, but I think we have pretty encouraging results. And I also think it's just exciting that this is another broad application area of these techniques for kind of using AI and democracy for AI governance.
So you name check Colin and he's shaking his head. So I'll go over to you next and then over to Robert to hear what you're working on in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't speak for OpenAI, but I will disclose that it's public on the link that I shared that I was an advisor for guiding these grants. There's $1 million in grants that was awarded, I guess, in July. It's wrapped up this month now with 10 open source projects that advance the state of the way in which LLMs could be used in systems like Polis. In their blog and the grant call, they specifically named Polis, and I think the expression, I think the kids say "rest in peace, my inbox." I'm now old enough that expression is I'm not sure, but I think it's right. There were quite a few reach outs around the world about the grant. And the thing that I think stands out is how extraordinary the groups, including Ariel's, were that were able to kind of break off meaningful chunks. One thing that I will add to the discussion here with regards to citizen participation is the term agentic elicitation, which is quite a mouthful, but basically it means, if you've got a survey and you're doing elicitation that is, what do you feel about option A? And then it's open-ended, or do you like A, B, C, or D? And it's a multiple choice. In this case, we're talking about a system, an agent, being aware of the conversation as it's occurring, and of course having the ability to poke, prod, and also move the discussion in a certain direction. And so I will now name check and pass over to Robert, because I know OpenAI was in Iceland too. So.
So I'll just continue. So actually our journey with AI in our sort of open source platforms, like your priorities, you can say it started in 2010. There was a huge volcano eruption, Eyjafjallajökull, that sort of you stopped all air travel in Europe for 5 days or something like that. So this caused like a huge tourism boom in Iceland, and as a result of that, in 2014. We had about 15,000 people living in Reykjavik, working in the tourism industry, that didn't speak any Icelandic. And they were there with their children, and the city wanted them to be a part of the, local democracy. So they talked to us and said, like, oh, maybe you should set up a Polish website, an English website, a Lithuanian, whatever. But we sort of convinced them that, now let's have machine translations. And it was early days of Google Translate. Almost every translation to Icelandic, you can find something funny about it. You can't do so much anymore. But that was the start. And it worked really well. It really empowered people to take part in the same place in those big projects by the city. And from there on, we've sort of always thought, how can we use AI to empower citizens? How can we use AI to empower decision making? And we've added things like automatic toxicity detection, voice to text, so you can speak in your ideas. But in the past year, there's been a huge explosion in capabilities, as we've seen with ChatGPT and other products. And our first sort of foray into that was to create a chatbot for your priorities. So, for example, for the participatory budgeting project in Reykjavik that had over 1,700 ideas last year. Of course, you can sort of swipe through them and look through them on your phone, but why not have a chatbot where you can actually ask about those ideas? So that's one capability that's extremely useful for some people, to be able to have access to the information from large projects available in a chat sort of hybrid interface, where you can ask about ideas, and the ideas that are found, there's little icons you can click to open up the ideas. And so there's a lot of opportunities there in terms of making citizen engagement easier. But the big opportunity, we believe, is with automating citizen engagement processes. And for that, we've been creating a new project called PolicySynth in collaboration with GovLab and others. And it's this idea, how can we use AI for what it's really good at today in a practical way? So the first thing that we realized that could help is automated web research. So let's say we're looking for root causes of a problem. We can use technology like GPT-4 to create search queries, and then use Google to actually search for the things we want. Then we can, use technology to basically scan thousands of websites, and then look at, search for what we're looking for, to sort of automate it, like research. Of course, you could have a team of people doing this, on, tens of computers. But, if you have a 10-page PDF about, democratic theory, and you're looking for some information in it, or like a 100-page PDF, GPT-4 is pretty good. It looks at every page, looks for the information. And so that's one of the things. But also in terms of helping to automate engagement at different levels, to save time for governments to be able to engage with large groups of people, as we like to do. But the core principle of what we're doing with PolicySynth and everything else is that all the ideas, the alignment, the choices that are made are always with the human in charge. A human is sort of driving this process, but using the AI to help us automate it, to make it practical for governments to actually engage really large groups of people. I leave it at that.
My goodness, we're starting to see some questions come in the chat, and I just want to let everybody know that we do want to move now to questions. So if you would please put your questions or some indication of what your question is about in the chat, that would be wonderful. And I will try to move us now into the Q&A. What we will do is, since we are live streaming this conversation, we will sort of have a closed Q&A, if you will, up until the end of the hour. And then following the end of the hour, we will turn off the live stream and have an opportunity for people to also ask their own questions out loud for the three of our speakers who could stay a little bit longer, if you can, and have a little more open-ended conversation for a few minutes after the end of the hour. So please do put your questions in the chat, labeled as question, which will help us to see them in amongst all the links. And let me just ask you, Robert, I'll continue back with you, and then we'll go over to Michael's question next. Is just with the ability, one of the great promises, I think, of this new technology is the ability to create content easily, which could level the playing field for anyone, including low literacy and non-native speakers, to be able to craft responses, participation of different kinds, whether by voice or by text, for an engagement. Do we worry, though, about the world of AI talking to AI? In other words, we already have a problem of bots submitting comments on a regulations.gov or other kinds of sites. Are we worried that we're just going to move to a world of an arms race between the different content creation systems, essentially just talking to one another?
Yes, I think there's a risk there. I think that one of the things that we are really looking, always at, for every design is that, how does it affect human agency? When it's like, when are you giving too much of it away? Of course, it's a spectrum, in a way. Of course, sometimes you give some of it away for collaboration, but keeping understanding that. And for example, we actually added for our, chatbot, we tested a feature where we could say, create an idea for a dog park, for the PB. It worked great. It created an image, with the Stable Diffusion API, but we tested it with people, and we tested it ourselves as well. It was just too easy. It would just mean that it would just be filled, the idea space would be filled with GPT-4 or other type of AI-generated content. But on the other side, I think the accessibility has a huge potential there.
Let's bring in the questions from the chat here. I'm wondering, Ariel and Colin, if you've had a chance to read them. Maybe Ariel, I can go back to you. If you see Michael's question, does that speak to you to want to answer? And Colin, the question from Rolf seems a natural for you.
Sure. Yeah, so the question from Michael is, people are becoming increasingly emotional and angry and polarized. How would AI help reduce polarization and facilitate meaningful political discourse? But that's a huge question. Like, there's so much work and discussion of this. Yeah, let me just mention a couple of things off the top of my head, like from my kind of biased viewpoint. So one place where I think AI can really help is in managing deliberation and discussions. So we're already seeing this in the context of things like citizen assemblies that I mentioned, early attempts to use tools in order to moderate the discussion, and where one of the goals is to have a more respectful discussion where everybody kind of has time to express their opinion and is not afraid to express their opinion. So that's one place where kind of bringing in these AI tools into a variety of discussions, I think, can really help with polarization and changing the nature of the discussion. Another quick kind of idea which we worked on is thinking about the algorithms themselves. In often like when we think about this issue of polarization, the issue of social media comes up. Robert brought that up as well, and a lot of discussions centered around what's the role of algorithms in creating these polarization and filter bubbles and so on. So there's some debate regarding how big the role of algorithms actually is, but to the extent that it's the algorithm's fault, like the natural solution would be algorithms and AI as well. So for example, one thing we have worked on is thinking about how we expose people to a more diverse range of content algorithmically. And specifically, the question we asked was, to what degree would this actually harm the bottom line of social media companies? Right? The thought is, they're doing this because they want to make a profit, because it kind of pays off to show people only what they want to see and create this polarization. But the question is that really the case? And I think we have a much better understanding now of what's the trade-off between engagement and diversity of content that suggested maybe the trade-off is not as bad as we thought it might have been. So that's one place where we can use these computational tools, algorithmic tools, and AI to change how the algorithms are working, create more diversity, potentially not even at a great cost to engagement, which makes it more likely that social media companies would actually adopt these tools.
Colin, so I think you want some clarification on the question. Do you want to answer what you understand, and we can
Yeah, I'll just start by saying I think it's not an either or. Thanks, Beth. I don't think it's an either or between going big and going small. Both of these are even just in our work. I can point to the Citizens Assembly in Austria, which ran 5 polls conversations to instruct, doing mapping to instruct various aspects of their process, which is, I think, a relatively small group of citizens. Versus something like community notes. And so I think the answer, in short, is both and. There's not necessarily a trade-off. However, I think that there's enormous benefit in considering systems that can be scaled out very quickly, on a platform like Twitter globally across many locales, and since there is so much interaction and so much conversation located there. One addition, though, I would have is that if you look at there's an arc in the history of communication that I think with how discussion is located with information. And so I think that a seminal event that I believe is not really focused on enough is the time around when news sites were shutting off their comments. NPR shut down their comments, and there was a lot of discussion when that happened. But in fact, I think that as we consider platforms that can that are for instance, like the BBC joining Mastodon, I think it begins to play with some of the location of the conversation and information over time, and I think that's still a very important part of the conversation to have that does play across scale and locale and topic and issue and governing jurisdiction. And so I think it's still important to consider those considerations: where we build, what we build, why we build, and what the scales and outcomes are for them. But I think that we can fill up every quadrant in that matrix.
So I want to bring in Josh's question here. Wendy has an interesting question in the chat, but since it's not directly on participation, I would encourage us to answer it in the chat. And I want to come to Josh's question, which I had for you too, which is crystal balling it. What's the future that we imagine? If you want to do 5 years, if you want to do 10 years, if you want to, whatever the time horizon is, and that may be a relevant question here, is what is the time horizon given how fast these tools are accelerating? What do you see as being the bleeding edge? How do we see institutions changing? How do we imagine democracy looks different? And how do we avoid, are we in the same place as we were in 95 in terms of our hopes and dreams, or are we in a different moment? That's a lot. That's a lot. Who wants to go first?
I'll take that first. So we have been working on something for a while, you know, sort of in the AI sphere that we really believe in, you know, and we think that sort of is the future, which is this idea of having an AI agent that's looking out for your democratic needs and wants, and also to potentially offer your expertise in the right moments when your community needs you. So I believe, you know, if we're lucky, you know, I don't think it's like a utopia, it's more of a protopia, I hope, you know, from my perspective, but you know, that, you know, we'll have everybody who wants to have access to sort of AI agent, you know, technology that's not biased towards anything except you, where you are in control in terms of what your needs and wants are at any given moment, that helps you to effectively seek out opportunities to participate without overloading you with non-relevant participatory projects, if you like. And on the other side, in a well-functioning modern democracy that's gone through the AI transition, is that we'll have AI-assisted decision-making processes that are going to help us to make better decisions. And again, those systems also can't be, you know, just an API at a big tech company. You know, we need some approaches in terms of how AI evolves, where both personally we can trust our AI agents, but also governments are running AI agents that are not biased towards, you know, companies, for example. So, and I can see this future also sort of work with, you know, what's sort of slowly happening with 3D, you know, like AR and even like VR with like simple glasses in a few years. Hopefully, we've been dreaming about this since year 2000 or sooner. You know, yeah, probably 95. But so, you know, and you know, I think that for it to succeed, it also needs to be like an enjoyable activity. You know, you taking part in your community. You know, you making some positive contribution to the community by participating. You know, so I think it's a, you know, yeah, it's a bit Star Trek-y, I guess. You know, but like a gamified thing where everything looks really cool, and but you're in control, the citizen.
Who wants to look and gaze into the crystal ball next?
I can go next.
Go for it.
Yep.
No,
So,
please.
Yeah, so I really like the point Robert brought up about kind of these AI agents representing us, like that. The first step is implicit in what I was describing before, with the LLMs predicting people's opinions over statements that we haven't seen before, right? So that's the kind of thing we would want to see, but of course, much more reliable and on a much larger scale. The other thing I wanted to bring up that I think is fundamentally different, and I also alluded to before, is this idea of generating alternatives instead of just being stuck with a fixed set of alternatives. Right, so just to elaborate on that a bit, like, you know, if we think again about Brexit, the way things work now is you present, even when you have this kind of direct democracy with referendum, you present people with two options, either, you know, option A or option B in that case, and that's often the case where you have only two options. And I think, to me, it's incredibly exciting to think about a world where all of the possible policies are on the table, and people, instead of voting for A or voting for B, express their opinion. And the outcome is a policy that is not something that was predetermined, but something that is, you know, maybe people haven't even explicitly thought about before. So that's something that generative AI, you know, it's, of course, there are many dangers, and the stakes would be very high, but and maybe it's not even 10 years from now, although we've been surprised, like in the last 2 years, by the progress of LLMs. But I feel like that would be incredibly exciting, very different from how things are now, and something that could potentially happen.
Colin, over to you.
I shared 2 links into the chat, which I'll briefly focus on. I think there are a number of top-level challenges that, after 11 years in development, are pretty you know, pretty distilled down. Some of these, because these systems operate in text text space, so to speak, are particularly amenable to large language models and the new technologies that have emerged this year. So there is a paper that was done this year in collaboration with Anthropic, and that's one of them. That tries to address some of the hardest and most pernicious of these issues and around summarization. And this is a hard problem because the more that the more signals that we integrate into, and this is exactly to speak to Robert's description, right? And Ariel as well, for mapping, if we're taking in all these inputs from citizens, and if we're doing all this in behalf of them, taking actions on behalf of them, or there's a deliberative space which involves agents, allowing anybody to get an accurate summarization of what's occurred, whether that's a political official or a citizen themselves, as the number of interactions and statements goes into the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands and millions, is a definable and excellent challenge for this space that gets at the concept of representation. How do you represent what has happened? How do you represent someone's views? How do you do so concisely? Obviously, at one end of the extreme, you have every single thought that every single individual has on every single issue, and at the other end of the extreme, you have Marco Rubio on CNN saying, what Floridians really think, and then that's like, we want to be somewhere in between there, and much closer to the left. So we're not there yet, but we do have more dimensionality in a conversation like the one that happened on fisheries in the UK. A lot more dimensionality happening there. A lot more dimensionality happening in Iceland in those conversations. How much dimensionality can we get, and how much coherence? I think we're going to push that frontier. I think we're going to push it really far over the next decade. I think we should aim really, really high.
Aiming really, really high is definitely where we want to go. So I want to remind people that what we're going to do is end our live stream for those who are joining us via the whatever sphere that you're in right now, the YouTube sphere. For those who are here in the room, we invite you to stick around, and we'll ask you to raise your hand if you want to ask a question. But I would be remiss if I first didn't let you know that we have another event coming up. The next event is going to be November 16th at 5 p.m. I'm sorry, let me get that right again. Excuse me, November 9th at 5 p.m. We're actually going to do the future of AI and youth democracy. I will not be moderating that conversation because the speakers there will all be under the age of 30. And we'll be hearing from people like Sneha Revanur, who's the founder and president of Encode Justice, which is the world's first and largest youth advocacy group in AI, for example, as well as a number of other speakers who are coming to us to talk about youth democracy and what AI can do to enable it. So we're going to put a link in the chat for signing up for that, and for any of our other events. November 16th will be Sir Jeff Mulgan talking about collective intelligence and artificial intelligence on the 16th, and on the 9th, we'll have youth democracy. So again, please don't leave us if you're here on Zoom. If you're on YouTube, come join us on Zoom. I want to thank, though, our three speakers, and I will ask Robert, Ariel, and Colin for 30 seconds each on how we can foster more conversation about the hopeful aspects of AI and democracy. Robert, go.
So I think it's important to empower civil society, and I think that civil society has a key role in terms of enabling this conversation to have impact. I think that collaboration between government, civil society, even if sometimes fraught, and problematic, I really think that's the path, towards both. Governance, working in the age of, the AI transformation. But I really also think that's sort of the best sort of practical approach when you want to connect large groups of citizens and their needs and wants, to, all those things that are happening in government.
Colin, 30 seconds.
Cover and study the wins thoroughly. And move $1 billion in funding to the space to build.
your mouth to someone's ears. Ariel.
Kind of building these systems, starting from a small scale, proof of concept, kind of showing people that it's possible, is, in my opinion, the best way to convince people that, you know, that we should move forward on that there is potential, and that more investment is worthwhile.
Thank you to all three of you. We'll turn off the YouTube now, and we move to our virtual wine and cheese, as I like to call it. In exchange, well, we can't give you cheese cubes. What we can do is